We are in the book of Judges, the 13th chapter, and momentarily we'll be picking up in the 15th verse. So that's Judges 13. We'll be starting in verse 15. We're going to finish the end of this chapter and then make some observations about the chapter, and then we'll see time-wise where we're at to see how far into chapter 14 we get. But that's the roadmap for this evening at any rate. So chapter 13, it would seem, is about a birth, right? Announcement of a birth. And the birth of a judge and in some regards a hero, right? If there is an individual in the Old Testament that is close to a modern day superhero, Samson is him, right? He's got a lot going for him. But as we'll note in a few moments, even though he's got so much going for him, here in the 13th chapter, as you've been paying close attention, I'm sure you're noticing some warning signs. And the life of Samson, in many regards, does not live up to all the potential that he has. So what a travesty that is. But when we stopped last week after the 14th chapter, we saw that an angel had come to Manoah's wife and told her that she was going to have a child. And so in excitement, he also told him more, I should add, right? Not only she was going to have a child, that child was to be a Nazirite, meaning separated for God. He was to take Nazirite vow. And he was going to deliver the people. Now, she runs back and she tells Manoah, her husband, and what's the first thing ladies Manoah said? You remember?
He wanted to talk to that guy.
Yeah, I need to talk to this guy for myself, right? Yeah, it's as though he didn't really trust him. And so he wants to meet him. He prays, asks they would meet him, and he does meet the individual. So the announcement at the end of 14 was given to Manoah a second time. It was first given to his wife, and then it was given to Manoah as he had asked to have it. So starting in verse 15, we'll pick up there and finish this chapter off. Would someone like to read 15 through 20 for us?
Manoah said unto the angel of the Lord, I pray thee, let us detain thee until we have made ready a kid for thee. And the angel of the Lord said unto Manoah, Though thou detain me, I will not eat of thy bread. And if thou wilt offer a burnt offering, thou must offer it unto the Lord. For Manoah knew not that he was an angel of the Lord. And Manoah said unto the angel of the Lord, What is thy name? That when thy sayings come to pass, we may do thee honor. And the angel of the Lord said unto him, Why askest thou thus after my name, seeing it is secret? So Manoah took the kid with the meat offering and offered it upon the rock unto the Lord. And the angel did wondrously, and Manoah and his wife looked on. For it came to pass, when the flame went up towards heaven from off the altar, the angel of the Lord ascended in the flame of the altar. And Manoah and his wife looked on it and fell on their faces to the ground.
Thank you, Mike. So before we get into the details of these 5 verses, I see that since I last called out the individuals online, we've got Leslie with us, as well as John. It's good to have both of you with us, although John's with us for not such a good reason. I called him this evening and said, do you have plans tonight? And assuming he'd say yes, but he said, no, I'm not doing anything. He's not feeling well. So, and Mom and Dad are with us on there as well. So hello to those of you as well. So back to chapter 13, Manoah says, hey, allow us to detain you, allow us to keep you, to delay you, if you will. And it would seem to me that Manoah wants to show hospitality. It's still a part of our culture today to be hospitable to visitors. It was even a stronger element of their culture this day that you actually had a responsibility to take care of visitors that came to you. And I think Abraham and the three angels visitors that visited him are a good example of that. So Manoah says, hey, let's stop here. The angel doesn't know whether he intends to give them a meal or make an offering to the Lord. And so he says, if you're going to have something to eat or drink, I'm not eating or drinking with you. But if you want to prepare something, make an offering for the Lord. And it seems at that point, we've read that Manoah doesn't know he's an angel. But it seems that Manoah is starting to strongly suspect, because he says, give us your name. Why? Did you catch that? Yeah. And he wants to honor him or give him credit, as Mike said. It seems to me, and there's a little bit of assumption here, but knowing that idolatry was something that was rampant at this time, angel worship is something that even into the time of Jesus and after the Hebrew people dealt with, it seems to me that he's starting to suspect he's an angel, and he wants to honor him. He asks him, what's his name? And the pagan culture that they lived in at that time, by knowing a God's name, you had some amount of control over them. That's how you called on them. You asked for blessings. It's one of the things that really stands out about the Hebrew God, is that his name was so sacred, they didn't even write it out. In many regards, he didn't have a name. That's going too far, but it's not a gross exaggeration. That's in contrast to the pagan culture where, again, if you knew their name, you had some amount of trouble or power over them. And so the angel says, my name is secret, or the ESV says wonderful. That's not his name, right? In case you're wondering. He's saying it's beyond you. It's something that it's not going to be revealed. It's something amazing. And so with that, then the offering is made, and the fire from the offering rises towards heaven, and the angel with the flame ascends into heaven. At that point, Manoah and his wife fall on their face. Right? They realize that they had been in the presence of a much superior being. And they're fearful, right? If you haven't glanced ahead yet, what's the first thing that they're going to think? We're going to die, right? And we touched on that last week. The reason for that is the holiness of God is too much for corrupt individuals. Again, Peter is a good example of that. We meet Jesus with the catch. Peter falls down. He says, "Depart from me, I'm a sinful man." Right. The idea there in the Hebrew mindset was that entering the presence of God was too much for sinful beings, and so they're fearful they're going to die. Questions or comments? Would someone read 21 through 25, the last verses here, chapter 13?
The angel of the Lord appeared no more to Manoah and to his wife. Then Manoah knew that he was the angel of the Lord. And Manoah said to his wife, "We shall surely die, for we have seen God." But his wife said to him, "If the Lord had meant to kill us, he would not have accepted a burnt offering and a grain offering at our hands or shown us all the things, or how announced to us such things to these? And the woman bore a son, and called his name Samson. And the young man grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in Mahanaim between Zorah and Eshtaol.
Thank you. So those last places, location, that seems to be in the area of Dan. I don't know why we could have just said in Dan instead of having Bob trying to pronounce those places, right? So the angel does not reappear. They know it's an angel. They think they're going to be fearful, or they're going to die. At least Manoah thinks that. And his wife is the calm, relaxed, reasonable one, right? You see the strong contrast between the two of them. And she says, if he was going to kill us, he wouldn't have accepted our offering. We would have died. We've been in his presence for, some time, she's saying. And now that he's gone, you think we're going to die? So she calms Manoah down. And so with that, then, we move on at the end of the chapter with her bearing a son and calling his name Samson. And Samson means sun. Sam means sun. So bright sun, as bright as sun. Sun's brightness is the concept of what Samson's name means. So you've got that idea of potential there, right? Now, I want to come back and make some observations that I think really draw home this idea, because the struggle with the book of Judges, and we've talked from the beginning about the downward spiral of not just the people, but the deliverers, the judges. These people are not good people in many regards. They've got significant character flaws, significant problems in their life, and Samson that's an understatement for him, right? One commentator said that Samson, the people are soon going to find out that they have a leader that chases women rather than enemies, and what you call it slipped my mind, vendettas instead of justice, and that can be said of Samson. So one of the problems of Judges is these people are used as deliverers, and yet they're not great people in many regards. So what's the message of the book of Judges? In fact, many critics, I've had discussions along this line, that will say, well, look, God claims to be a righteous God, but look, he condones all this horrible behavior. How can he be so righteous? Well, there's an obvious rebuttal to that is, on its surface, that God doesn't condone it, right? But these are the people he's using. So what's the message? I think this 13th chapter really brings it out better than any other chapter. What's the message of Judges? The deliverance is going to depend on who? Who's the deliverance going to depend on? Samson? Kind of. But does it really depend on Samson? Depends on God, right? Not Samson. I think Ernie's kind of getting it. Whoever God chooses, right? God's in control there. The deliverance depends on God. And what we're seeing in many regards is he continues to deliver the people, even with less and less capable or suitable individuals. And that's one of the amazing parts of the book of Judges. Now, obviously, or it's not, if it was obvious, I wouldn't have to say it, right, Tom? So not so obviously, all these judges or deliverers are pointing, forecasting, foreshadowing, I mean to say, the Christ, right? And they foreshadow him in that God is going to provide a deliverance, and they contrast with Christ in that Christ is perfect, the deliverer that he's meant to be, and these individuals are not. Right? How many of you remember the show MacGyver? Oh, most of you. That was my favorite show growing up. And David, I think you, Ryan, and I watched MacGyver and A-Team together a fair amount. Yeah. And you know how MacGyver was able to use whatever was there and still, blow up the enemy fortress and escape from the underwater glass prison, or, with no tools whatsoever. Yeah, with a little pocket knife, and normally it seems like a paper clip was involved, huh? Yeah, just this wee little thing, Bob says. He's right. And so that's what we kind of see God doing here, bringing about this amazing deliverance without so much. Now, here's the other side of this, and this is the side that haunts me. I alluded to this and in some ways stated it earlier. Samson probably had more potential than any of the judges before him. He was certainly given more, and yet he does less with it than any of the judges. He doesn't even provide as much of a deliverance as the judges prior to him. Would you say Samson was a success story? It's a difficult question, huh?
He was at first. He left that life, giving the health up, and then he really messed up.
Yeah, he did. And Bob brings up the fact is he allows his wife to influence him, but I think he influenced her too, didn't he? In a very negative way. Even where he went and found her, right? It was not a good story. Now, John, as usual, is at least a step ahead of me, which I greatly appreciate. He says God was a success story. And that's the truth, right? Samson didn't live up even to his potential. And that's the story of chapter 13 more clearly than any of these other chapters. That God is the success, despite what he's working with. In that way, Samson provides a tremendous encouragement for me, right? And for you. He can be used. Now, we've made those statements because we know what comes in chapter 14, 15, and 16. And your memory might be a little cloudy, it might be a little while since you've read through those, but you know that Samson gets in a lot of trouble he ought not do. Otherwise, chapter 13 would seem like we're set up for a wonderful story. But I want to note at least 4 of the warning signs that are present here. Number 1, in verse 1, we see that there has been a 40-year oppression. The significance of that is it's the longest of the book of Judges. And it would seem that most of the times of oppression were in direct correlation to the wickedness of the people. If that is true, then it's speaking very poorly of the Israelite people at this point. Secondly, in chapter 1, as we see that there was a 40-year oppression, there's something lacking that's been there every other judge that we've seen. Did you catch what's lacking? Verse 1, because it's been a while since we read it aloud. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord gave them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. So this is the trend that's happened over and over, right? People do evil. God gives them into the hands of the oppressors. And then what's the next stage that normally happens? They cry out for help. What's lacking in this verse? There's no cry for help. Serious warning signs. Serious warning signs. In verse 2 and 3, we see a double notation of barrenness. The fact that Manoah's wife was unable to have children. Why is that a warning sign? Because it was given as a curse for when the people were wicked, right? It's a sign. The author, it's not about Manoah's wife being wicked. That's not at all what I'm saying, or I think the author's implying. The author is giving us some insight into the kind of culture that the story of Samson takes place. To go along with that, in verses 4, 7, and 14, there's a triple mention of dietary restrictions. I don't know about you, but this jumped out at me. So there are three primary elements of the Nazirite vow. Number one, no temporary, no grape products, right? Number two, don't touch anything dead. And number three, don't cut your hair, right? Now, when the angel comes to Manoah's wife and then later to Manoah, he tells her something that was odd to me. And that is, don't eat, this is verse 4, anything unclean. Don't eat anything unclean. Why would that be odd? That's not even part of the vow, is it? That was like standard. They weren't supposed to eat anything unclean. And it's mentioned 3 times. Don't eat anything unclean. It's probably a pretty good indicator of where the people were in light of God's word. Fourthly, Manoah tries to take charge. Is Manoah a leader? No. He tries to take charge. In fact, I alluded to this earlier. What characteristic do you notice about Manoah as we read through this story? Is he a calm guy? Doesn't seem to be, right? He's a nervous guy. He's anxious. He's, worried about what's going to happen. Now, I need to see this myself. Right? He tries to take charge right off the bat, and I think it's hilarious myself. He says, I want to see this guy that told you this. And then the angel reappears to Manoah's wife, not to Manoah. And she goes and gets him and says, come on, Manoah, he's here. And, it's the angel or God's way, I think, of saying, no, I will give you the message as well, but this is who the message was really intended for. Now, here's what's interesting. What does the name Manoah mean? I don't ask it because I expect you to know. I ask it because I researched it, and I know. It sounds like the Hebrew word for rest. So all throughout the Old Testament, God's promise had to do with rest, right? Peace and prosperity, or summarized by rest, was symbolic of God's blessings upon the people. Manoah meant rest. Do you seem like a restful person? No, not at that. Not at all. So you take all that, accompanied with the fact that there's no cry for help from the people, at least none recorded. The author has given us a good indication that there's trouble ahead, right? Speaking of trouble, I mentioned these three elements of the Nazirite vow. No grape products, no corpse, touching no corpse, and not cutting their hair. Okay, Bob, you already mentioned this one. You mentioned Delilah. What does she give him to do? Cut his hair. So now he's 2 for 3, right? Hey, Jeff and Dean, if he was a batter, batting 667, it's a really good batting average, right? But what do you know he touches constantly in the story, in the chapters to come? Dead animals and people, for that matter, right? Dead corpses. Uh-oh. Now we're down to 333. Yeah. And that last one, the only surviving element of the Nazirite. Yeah. Oh, any grape products. He's forbidden, as Rita brought up to us last week, from any grape products. Well, guess what? He's partying constantly, right? Now, that one's not expressly said, but from everything else, it looks like the Nazirite vow is not something that Samson holds to very well. With that said, before we get into chapter 14, I think there's some really neat, unique aspects of the story of Samson as it pertains to one of the judges. Number one, it's an unsolicited deliverance on behalf of God. Up until this point, the people always were crying out, "Save us, save us." This time we don't see that. God is saving them, just saving them. What does that emphasize about God? What characteristic? Compassion? Yeah. What does God's compassion compel him to give? Grace. When you said compassion, Ernie, I thought, well, that's a good one. It wasn't the one I was thinking of. Yeah, grace is what I was thinking of, but it does emphasize his compassion too. They're suffering. He's going to deliver them. Again, the essence, or pointing to the idea that the deliverance depends on God. Right? Now, sometimes we get uneasy with that concept because we've heard imagery of God dragging people by their hair despite their desire to salvation, right? And we like to emphasize obedience. And I don't think emphasizing the deliverance of God de-emphasizes our need to follow after him. That's logical. But it depends on God, right? Even if I do my best to obey, I'm not going to cut it. I'm not going to get there. I'm not going to get it done, right? The emphasis is really relying on this idea. God will provide the deliverance. So, what a beautiful message. A couple more things to point out. Questions or comments on that before we move on? By the way, I didn't prepare for this. I don't say hands up. But is it our deliverance an unsolicited deliverance? I just happen to think about Romans 5. Christ went to the cross long before we ever called out to him, right? He sent our deliverer there for us. What a wonderful demonstration of compassion and grace. Secondly, unique aspect, and there's great foreshadowing here. Chapter 13, the angel of the Lord comes to Manoah's wife, and what does he say she's going to bring? Or what's he say? Let me say it a little more clear. What does the angel say is going to happen? It's going to have a son. Now, I've thought about this about Isaiah. But the same would be true here. The people are oppressed by mighty armies during the life of during the life of Isaiah. And what does God promise them? A baby. Seems kind of ridiculous, right? Here they are oppressed. And God promises a baby. But unlike the rest, he's not using a judge that's already there. He's not using an individual who's prepared to be a leader. He is starting from scratch, so to speak. It's a really interesting, great point by John. Samson was not obedient, right? But he was full of grace. That's an amazing picture there for us. So, don't allow the deliverer to eclipse the deliverance. I think that's when we get criticized, or people criticize the deeds of the judges. That's what they're doing. The message isn't about Samson. It's about God. That's what we're emphasizing on tonight. Final point, without God's gracious action, there's no story worth telling, right? Samson, even if he's got all this strength and all these abilities, without God's grace, there's no story worth telling. And that's a great point for us. Questions or comments on chapter 13? All right, we have right about 8 minutes to introduce chapter 14. We've introduced some of Samson's interesting exploits, and so now we'll be introduced to them in person, I guess. Judges 14, starting in verse 1. Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. When he came up and told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. But his father and mother said to him, is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among our family, our people, that you must go take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. So, all kinds of good stuff here. He is at Timnah, He's hanging out with the Philistines, and someone catches his eye. He says, she is right in my eye. She looks good, he's saying. Get her for me. It's interesting to me that someone as strong as Samson sends his father to get a girlfriend for him, but that's how he did it. It's odd to us, verse 2, or rather verse 3, that to us it would look like his father is saying, Manoah is saying, can't you find a girl at the family reunion? Right? But that's not quite what he's saying. He's talking about within the Israelites, likely even within the tribe of Dan, that can't you find someone? They were forbidden from marrying the Philistines, right? Although we're going to see God has an interesting plan in store for them. Ernie, I don't know if you or Pam heard it, but at our family reunion this year, Rowan and I were partners for the cornhole tournament. And he kept throwing his sack, his corn sack, short of the board. And I kept yelling to him, Rowan, put all you got behind it. How are you going to impress all these girls if you don't put some strength behind it? And I kept saying that to him. I don't think he ever realized what I was really saying, but I was trying to tell him he needed to impress the other girls at the family reunion, but he just wasn't catching on to that nuance. But that's not exactly what Manoah is saying. He's saying, can't you find a girl from the people of the Israelites, right? Because we were forbidden from marrying outside the Israelites. Bob brought this up. The reason for that was the people were given the land to be different, to not be like everyone else. That was their purpose, to show what God's people look like. And they were just like all the rest of the people. That's the background behind Manoah's conversation with them. Questions or comments? Verse 4. His father and his mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. This is a difficult verse for me. This verse gives me caution, I guess, at times. Was God's law clear on this matter? Was God's law clear on the matter of Samson marrying a Philistine? Yes, it was clear. Like failure. Okay, I think John's saying they felt like failures. I was struggling with the last word there. I think he's right, and I'll tie these two things together. Ernie says his law was clear, right? He's not to marry Philistine, and John points out his mother and father probably felt like failures, right? Like they really messed up. They know how much potential he has, right? They were given the promise, and speaking of potential, I very unintentionally skipped over verse 25. I apologize. But that's where the Spirit is starting to move on Samson. And but what's interesting is what no one could see. What no one could see. Because this was God's plan. Right? It's a strong caution against presumptuousness, isn't it? Now, is this going to lead to good things? No. That's kind of the point. That's the kind of leader that Samson is. And I think part of the message is that God was going to use Samson. This is who he was. And God's going to use him. Questions or comments? No. Ernie's smiling. Ooh, I should have foreseen that. To answer that shortly, I think it's God understanding his character. That is a good question to get into, though, and to look at. So we're going to stop there. I want you to think about verse 25, because it's going to come up later. And by the way, Samson, I believe, is the fourth and the final judge in the book of Judges that we see the Spirit coming on. So it's something very special, stirring him like this. It's something very special, and we're going to see it happen in different ways as we go forward. So kind of look for that as you read ahead, and we'll discuss that as we go. Thank you.
Smash that button, hit subscribe.